Hello everyone. I'd like to introduce microeconomics course today. I'm Chang-Soo, lecturer of intermediate level microeconomics. So this course is different from introductory level microeconomics, right? Intermediate level microeconomics. Yeah. At the introductory microeconomics level, everything is explained using simplistic graph without any math skills. But intermediate level microeconomics require to understand some mathematical tools, right? So that is different. So should be careful for that. My office is this building 407, right? Okay, so prerequisite of this course is introductory level micro and macroeconomics. Right? My recommendation is in more than required course. Mathematics for economics, because mathematical skills is required to understand my course, intermediate level course. Outline of course is as follows. This is designed to introduce students to analytical skills of microeconomics, analytical skills. Microeconomics is typically made of three components, such as consumers, firms, and finally markets, where consumers and firms interact. We deal with these three components sequentially. Okay? So in consumer theory, we study utility maximization problem. Firms, we study profit maximization condition and some cost minimization problems. And market, in the market, we solve equilibrium condition for consumers and firms. When the market is perfectly competitive first, then you go monopoly market equilibrium condition and oligopoly market equilibrium condition. So in oligopoly, especially oligopoly market equilibrium condition is very new to you, and your final grades decide in that lecture. Right? We deal with these three components sequentially. The course starts by introducing consumer preference and utility maximization problem, then firms and production function. Finally, we study the market clearing conditions in various market structures, perfectly competitive market structure, monopoly market, and oligopoly market. Then we move factors market. This course also studies thoroughly factors market, labor market and capital market. Then finally, we go general equilibrium of microeconomics, chapter 16, I think, 18, I think, right? So general equilibrium chapters, we summarize intermediate level microeconomics. The objective of this course is to help students to understand basic concepts of microeconomics, such as utility maximization, cost minimization, profit maximization, and general equilibrium conditions. On successful completion of this unit, students should be able to apply these analytical concepts to the ordinary business of life, as well as current issues and events. So in midterm and finally, and we have actually 4 exams. In these 4 exams, questions are applied one. So memorizing everything in PowerPoint, no help in solve 4 exams. Your own studies, right? And your capability of applying the basic concept in slightly different situation. So in sum, your application capability matter for a successful completion of my course. Strict attendance rules, no recognition of absence due to employment, internship, and etc. by senior or foreign students. So I emphasize no discrimination, no preference, some rules. So should be careful for that. Evaluation, first exam, midterm exam, and midterm 2, and final exam, 4 types of exams, right? So attendance is like this. But this semester, I'm not so serious about your attendance. Your attendance, if you skip more than, where is it? 8 or 9 times, you automatically failed, right? If you're skipping less than 8 times, then everybody has the same scores in attendance. So your final grade decided only by 4 exams, basically, right? So I should be careful for that. So this kind of my ordinary rule is not applied in this emergency situation. Student automatically fails if skipping more than 9 times or failing to attend one of the 4 exams. Should be careful for this. So textbook. So intermediate level microeconomics written by Pindai and Rubinfield, right? This is the easiest one in micro level, intermediate level microeconomics textbook. So I use this. So skip. So look at this syllabus, right? After studying consumer theory, we have policy exam, right? This rescheduled, the exam date rescheduled based on the changes in this semester. And we studied production and profit maximization when the market is perfectly competitive. Then we have midterm exam. After that, equilibrium condition when the market is imperfect, monopoly or monopolist competition, we have midterm exam, midterm 2. And finally, market factors market and general equilibrium. We studied these 2 chapters and we have final exam. Okay? So so this after midterm exam, midterm 2 and final exams is very new to you, right? Very new. So you have to study very thoroughly to pass my course. Others, violation of academic integrity, cheating, plagiarism, false attendance, false documentation in and out during the class, checked, right? Blah, blah, blah. And 3 misconceptions. Number 1, attending the class is not enough to understand the content, right? Your own preview and review is really important. If you want to get A+ or A0, you have to solve some chapter questions for yourself. That is really necessary for you to receive high records. Number 2, skipping class should not be okay because you cannot understand subsequent chapters, right? If you skip chapter 1, chapter 2, you can understand chapter 3 and 4 like this. So sequence matter in this course, right? So should be careful for this. In and out and use a mobile phone during the class are not possible in my course. That is my syllabus. Okay, then we go chapter 2. Okay, chapter 2 is basics of supply and demand. This chapter is not new to you. You already studied all of this kind of thing, but so a kind of review session, right? This chapter 2 is composed of 7 subsections. Subsection number 1, supply and demand, and the market mechanism. Section 3, change in market equilibrium, right? So demand and supply decide this. So reaching at equilibrium when quantity demanded is equal to quantity supplied, isn't it? That is basic idea of market. And we study more about this when change happen in demand or supply, shift in demand and or shift in supply, then what happened, right? So supply and demand model is simplistic and easiest something, but we can get lots of ideas from this simplistic version of the model. And section 4, elasticities of supply and demand. At this section, we study price elasticity of demand, price elasticity of supply, income elasticity of demand, cross elasticity of demand, sort of things, right? And section 5, short-run versus long-run elasticity. So blah, blah, blah. And section 6, understanding and predicting the effects of changing market conditions. So in tests, you have to solve some quantitative one, right, to receive some mark. So the explanation is easy, but to solve test questions are difficult one, right? Should be careful for this. Okay, basics of supply and demand. Supply-demand analysis is a fundamental and powerful tool that can be applied to a wide variety of interesting and important problems. To name a few, understanding and predicting how changing world economic conditions affect market price and production, right? For example, recently, because of novel coronavirus, world demand may be shrinks, right? The demand shift to the left, then what happened in production and price and equilibrium quantity like this. Second, evaluating the impact of government price controls, minimum wages, price support, and production incentives. For example, minimum wage legislation leading to increase in demand, but decrease in supply. So unemployment problem happen, right? Severe. So it's really easy thing, but lots of people ignore this kind of simple models prediction, right? Also, based on this COVID-19 crisis, for example, United States now think about tax deduction in farms to increasing production, right? But in Korean politicians now thinking about income subsidies, right? Quite different approach, and we can think about the result of these two different kinds of approach to facing this some economic recession problems. Determining how tax subsidies, tariffs, and input quotas affect consumers and producers, right? Okay, the supply curve. Supply curve relationship between quantity supplied that producers are willing to sell and the price of good, that is supply curve, right? So I'd like to use this one. Quantity supply is function of its own price and others, right? So production cost, for example, right? Lots of costs, like this. And for example, technology, productivity level like this, right? And supply curve, basically a relationship between its own price and quantity supplied, right? Price increase, then supply of that good increase. Price decrease, then quantity supply decrease. Positive relation between supply curve and its own price, right? But other things, for example, cost or technological change happen, productivity increase, for example, then supply curve shift to the right or to the left, right? So this one changes, the relationship between this one and this one is categorized by movement along the same supply curve. But other things changes, then supply curve shift upward or downward, okay? Let's look at figure 2.1, the supply curve. The supply curve labeled as in the figure shows how the quantity of good offered for sale changes as the price of good changes. So price is P1, supply is Q1. Price decreased to P2, price is P2, then supply is this one, decrease, movement along supply curve, right? But other things, for example, if production costs fall, then supply curve shift to the right. Firms can produce the same quantity at a lower price or larger quantity at the same price. The supply curve then shifts to the right, right? So movement along the supply curve and shift in supply curve, okay? So two things quite different. Anyway, this concept is old one. You already studied this kind of idea in introductory level microeconomics. So look at other variables that affect supply. So shifters of supply curve. The quantity they produce are willing to sell depends not only on its own price they receive, but also on their production costs, including wage rates, interest charges, and the cost of raw material. For example, wage rate increase, then supply curve shifted to the left, right? If the cost of raw material decrease, then shift to the right. When production costs decrease, output increase no matter what the market price happens to be. The entire supply curve shifts to the right, to the upward. Right? I already explained this. Economists often use phrase change in supply to refer to shifts in supply curve, while reserving the phrase changing the quantity supplied to apply to the movement along the supply curve. This relationship between quantity supplied and its own price. Other things changes, supply shifts in supply curve, right? Two things different. Demand curve. Similarly, demand curve is quantity demand is its own price and other things. For example, income and others. Price of related goods, PJ, right? Its own price, other goods price, for example, like this. Right? The relationship between its own price and quantity demanded is graphed by demand curve. Demand curve is so price change, then quantity price increase, then quantity demand decrease. Price increase, decrease, then quantity demand increase. So negative relationship between its own price and quantity demanded. Movement along demand curve, right? But other things changes. For example, household income increase. Then household at the same price, household want to consume more, demand more. So demand curve shift to the right, right? Like this. That is shift in demand curve. Look at this. The demand curve label D shows how the quantity of goods demanded by consumers depends on its price. The demand curve is downward sloping. Downward sloping means negative relations, right? And first derivative of demand curve is negative. Holding other things being equal, consumers will want to purchase more of goods as each price goes down. That is law of demand, simply talking. The quantity demanded may also depend on other things, other variables, such as income, weather, and price of other goods. For most products, the quantity demanded increase when income rises. A higher income level shifts the demand curve to the right, this one to this one. So other things, other variables are shifters of demand curve, right? Its own price changes demand curve, some equilibrium point to move along the same demand curve. But other things changes, right? Income and price of related goods, demand curve shifted to the right or to the left. So other variables are shifters of demand curve. Shifting the demand curve. If the market price were hold constant at P1, we would expect to see an increase in the quantity demanded, say from Q1 to Q2. Q1 to Q2, when income increase, right? As a result of consumers' higher income. Because this increase would occur no matter what the market price, the result would be a shift to the right of the entire demand curve. Now think about the impact of related goods, right? This one, PJs. substitutes and complementary goods. Substitutes. Two goods for which an increase in the price of one leads to an increase in the quantity demanded with the other. We said two goods are substitutes with each other, right? And complement. Two goods for which an increase in the price of one leads to a decrease in the quantity demanded of the other. Then we said complements, right? What's the example of substitutes? For example, pizza and hamburger, or Pepsi and Coke, right? Latte and cappuccino. Price of one good increase, price of cappuccino increase, then demand for latte increase because latte and cappuccino are substitutes with each other, right? But now think about demand consumption of coffee, espresso, and coffee buns, or kind of bread, right? Then price of espresso increase, then demand of espresso decrease, right? At the same time, demand for coffee buns also decrease. That is complements case. So nothing new. So now we go supply and demand. Market mechanism. The market clears at price P0 and Q0. When price is P0, quantity demanded is Q0, right? Quantity supplied by firms is also same to Q0. So quantity demanded is equal to quantity supplied. So market clears. If the price is P1 higher than equilibrium price, then what happens? Supply by firms greater than household demand. Okay, so surplus happens. If price is lower than equilibrium price, then what happens? Quantity demand larger than quantity supply. So shortage situation occurs. Equilibrium or market clearing price. What is equilibrium price or market clearing price? Price that equates quantity supplied to the quantity demanded. Right? Market mechanism. Tendency in a free market for price to change until the market clears. Right? Tendency in a free market for price to change until the market clears. That is market mechanism. Right? For example, recently, demand for masks increased greatly. Right? But then, if market is free, then price of mask increase. Then supply of mask increase, demand for mask decrease, so reaching a new equilibrium point. That is market mechanism, right? Surplus. Situation in which the quantity supplied exceeds the quantity demanded. We already studied this. Shortages. Situation in which the quantity demanded exceeds the quantity supplied. So when can we use the supply-demand model? We are assuming that at any given price, a given quantity will be produced and sold. This assumption makes sense only if a market is at least roughly competitive. Market is competitive roughly. By this, we mean that both sellers and buyers should have little market power, little ability individually to affect the market price. Because there are lots of consumers, demanders, lots of suppliers, so individual consumer or supplier have no power to influence on market price. That is competitive, definition of roughly competitive market. Right? Suppose instead the supply were controlled by a single producer, then a monopolist. Right? If the demand curve shifts in a particular way, it may be in the monopolist's interest to keep the quantity fixed but change the price, or to keep the price fixed and change the quantity. So equilibrium condition when the market is monopoly is quite different from the equilibrium situation when the market is perfectly competitive. The equilibrium following shifts in supply curve. When the demand curve shifts to the right, this figure says supply curve shifts to the right instead of demand curve, right? When the supply curve shift to the right, what happens? The market clears at a lower price, P3, and larger quantity, Q3, right? So something wrong in this explanation for this. So next, new equilibrium following shifting demand. Demand curve shift like this, supply curve same, then what happens? When the demand curve shifts to the right, the market clears, new market clears at this higher price P3 than P1, and quantity larger than equilibrium, new equilibrium quantity Q3 larger than initial equilibrium quantity Q1. Okay? Nothing new. New equilibrium following shifts in supply and demand simultaneously. Supply and demand curve shifts over time as market condition changes. In this example, rightward shifts of supply curve, rightward shifts of supply curve from S to S dash, demand curve, and the demand curve D to D dash, right? Leads to a slightly higher price and a much larger quantity, increasing quantity Q1 to Q2 in new equilibrium. In general, changes in price and quantity depends on the amounts by which each curve shifts and the shape of each curve. Okay? Now, if the supply curve shifts like this, demand curve shifts like this, then what happens? Price increase more than P2 in this graph, and the increasing quantity smaller than Q2, right? So it depends on lots of situation. Okay, example. The price of X and price of college education in the United States. From 1970 to year 2010, the real price of X fell by 55%, whereas the real price of college education, price of education, rose by 82%. Price of X decreased, price of education increased greatly in the United States. How to explain this? Using supply-demand model, okay? The mechanism of poultry farms sharply reduced the cost of production X. So X market, this one decreased. So leading to supply curve shift to the right, right? So the demand curve for X shifts to the left as a more health-conscious population tends to avoid X, right? Because of this one, a diet problem, right? Diet-conscious population. Because of this, demand for X decreased. Supply curve, this one, cost decrease, right? In poultry farms, so that supply curve shift to the right? But healthcare concerns, demand curve shift to the left, right? That kind of thing happen in X market. But what happened in college? Increasing the cost increase in college education fees, cost increase greatly. Then supply curve shift to the left, right? And demand for college education increase. So demand curve shift to the right, like this. Okay? So in this case, price of X decrease, whereas price of education increased greatly in the latter case. Right? That is explained here. As for colleges, increasing the cost of equipping and maintaining modern classrooms, laboratories, and libraries, along with increasing faculty salaries, pushes the supply curve up, move upward to the left. The demand curve shifts to the right as a larger percentage of growing number of high school graduates decide that a college education was essential. So demand for college education increased, right? Leading to increase in demand. Okay, now explain using demand and supply graphs. So first, market for X. In 1970, this one. Demand curve is this one in 1970. Supply curve of X is like this in 1970s, right? Demand curve, supply curve changed from here to here, shift downward because production cost fell in poultry farm, right? And supply curve shifts like this because of production cost decrease. And demand for X also shift to the left from here to here in 2016 because diet concern, right? Then new equilibrium price should be here. Original one is here in 1970 equilibrium. 2016 equilibrium is here. Price decrease gradually, right? Price decrease greatly. Quantity, equilibrium quantity also decrease, increase a little. That is case for market for X, right? Now, market for college education. Supply curve shift upward like this. From 1970, supply curve in year 2016. Why? Production cost increase, right? Cost increase because of equipment, maintenance, and staffing salaries rose. Demand curve also increased greatly from 1970 to year 2016. 1970 equilibrium price is here, $2,112, right? But new equilibrium 2016 is this one. Price of tuition fee increased greatly, right? Supply also increased, price increased greatly, right? The demand curve shifts to the right as a growing number of high school graduates desire the college education. As a result, both price and enrollments rose sharply. Right? That is case of college education. That is figure explaining change in X market. Example 2.2, wage inequality in the US. Over the past 2 decades, the wages of skilled high-income workers have grown substantially. Why? The wages of unskilled lower-income workers have fallen slightly. Right? So this one can be explained, supply and demand curve, demand model. So now think about what is the difference between skilled labor and unskilled labor. Skilled labor usually means some experienced worker or some workers whose education, schooling years is greater than 16. So for example, college education workers, right? And unskilled workers means workers who high school or middle school graduate workers, that is unskilled worker, right? Or unexperienced workers. So anyway, we know that over the past 2 decades, wages of skilled workers increased greatly, whereas unskilled workers fallen slightly, right? That is really important thing. And we know this is a background of the success of Trump, right? White unskilled workers, their wages, income doesn't increase greatly at all. From 1978 to 2009, people in the top 20% of income distribution experience, so skilled high-income workers experience an increase in their average real pre-tax household income of 45%, while those in the bottom 20%, unskilled workers' income, so their average real pre-tax income increased by only 4%. While the supply of unskilled workers, people with limited education, has grown substantially in the United States because immigration from Latin American countries, for example, right? But demand for unskilled workers has risen only slightly. So supply increased greatly. Supply curve shifted to the right. Demand curve is almost same. So demand decreased greatly. Demand the same, supply curve increased greatly. So wage rate decreased, right? On the other hand, while the supply of skilled workers, for example, engineers, scientists, managers, and economists, has grown slowly, the demand has risen dramatically. Supply of skilled workers is limited, right? But demand increased, shift in demand, right? Increased greatly, dramatically, pushing wages up. That's the reason the wage gap between skilled and unskilled workers increased, and demand for college education increased greatly in the United States. Same thing happened all over the world, including Korea. Okay. The long-run behavior of natural resource prices, figure 2.8, consumption is demand, isn't it? and price of copper, right? Consumption or equilibrium quantity is like this. Over period, equilibrium consumption, equilibrium quantity increase gradually, right? Although annual consumption of copper has increased about 100-fold, the real price has not changed much. But price doesn't change, right? But why that happen, right? The long-term behavior of natural resource prices. Long-term movements of supply and demand for mineral resources, natural resources, right? We know that demand increase gradually, but also supply curve shift to the right gradually. Because of this, prices actually decrease, right? Although demand for most resources has increased dramatically over the past century, demand increase, shift in demand usually leading to increase in price, but that doesn't happen. Instead, prices have fallen or reasonably slightly in real terms. Why? Because cost reduction in mining, for example, leading to shift in supply curve to the right, right? Supply curve to the right. Because of this, price decrease instead of increase in this mineral resources case. Now, second example is example of 9/11 on the supply and demand for New York City office space. Look at this. Supply and demand for New York City office space. Following 9/11, the supply curve shifted to the left, right? Supply curve shifted to the left because of 9/11 situation. But demand also shifted to the left.